Rudy Giuliani in New Hampshire, interviews with the New Hampshire Secretary of State, and a reporter familiar with politics there. But first, Republican presidential candidate Representative Ron Paul of Texas. He speaks to the Robert Taft Club in Virginia about conservatism and American foreign policy. It's about an hour.
Executive board of the Robert Taft Club. I'd like to welcome everyone, particularly first-time members to Robert Taft events. I invite you to visit our website and see some of the interesting things we have coming on later in the year. We have some interesting things planned. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the other members of the executive board, Dan McCarthy and Kevin Deanna and Marcus Epstein, who actually founded the club just around a year and a half ago. And their tireless efforts are invaluable. Thank you. And I'd like to remind you that the Robert Taft Club, we're a nonpartisan group. We have many Ron Paul sympathizers amongst us, but we would certainly invite all presidential candidates to come speak at our forums. I think Giuliani would have a very interesting time. But I'd like to give a special thanks to the Ron Paul 2008 staff, particularly Amanda Lee, Jesse Benton, Jeff Frazee, and Justine Lamb, who worked with us the whole time. Thank you. I'd also like to thank, this evening would not be possible without the generous support of our patrons, particularly Peter Brimlow and the VDARE Foundation, Fernando Galaviz, and Howard Ziegermark, who all gave generously to the Robert Taft Club. I'd like to thank them. A year away from the presidential election, conservatives stand at a crossroads, especially when it comes to the issue of foreign policy. This is certainly not always the case. For 60 years, conservatives of a variety of stripes, traditionalists, libertarians, Wall Street conservatives, neocons, were able to look over some differences. This is 60, yeah. For 60 years this happened. Okay. They were able to look over some very obvious differences and able to rally around opposition to the Soviet Union. Indeed, I think one could say that the post-war conservative movement would be impossible without that foreign policy consensus. The end of the Cold War brought a host of new opportunities, but it also brought about some serious, very difficult questions that in many ways the conservative movement has been unwilling or perhaps incapable of answering, such as should the U.S. sustain the fighting force abroad, or should we withdraw and kind of bring the troops home and invest a peace dividend at home? Should we actually make considerations for the spread of democracy abroad, or spread of human rights abroad, or something like this, or to take part in humanitarian interventions? Also, what could be the role of international bodies that arose during the Cold War, such as the UN or NATO? Should these have a role to play afterward? Again, the conservative movement never answered these questions. Sometimes they would support interventions, sometimes not. Sometimes they would favor democratization, sometimes not. Certainly after 9/11, President George W. Bush has forcefully reinvented the foreign policy of the Republican Party, and by extension much of the conservative movement, to be one of active interventionary attacks. And to this he's married a visionary faith that America represents a universal system that we can export abroad. In the President's words, we are led by events and common sense to one conclusion: the survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands. The best hope for peace in our world is the expansion of freedom in the whole world, or Baghdad is going to be a democracy by next Tuesday. While such sentiments might be appealing, the reality of the U.S. occupation has led a substantial majority of Americans to disapprove of the President's conduct of foreign policy and to seriously question democratization as a foreign policy rationale. In this way, conservatives have an opportunity to chart a new course. If we're going to really rethink everything, then there's no one better to turn to than Representative Ron Paul of Texas. Amen. Representative Paul was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and graduated from Gettysburg College and Duke University Medical School. After serving as a flight surgeon in the U.S. Air Force, Paul and his wife Carol moved to Texas in 1968, where he began to practice as an obstetrician and gynecologist. And he's reportedly delivered some 4,000 babies since then. Paul first entered Congress in 1976, representing Texas' 22nd district, and he was one of only 4 Republicans to support the presidential candidacy of Ronald Reagan in that year. After leaving Congress and returning to medical practice, Paul ran for president in 1998 on the Libertarian Party ticket. And in 1997, he returned both to the GOP and to Congress, and this time representing Texas' 14th district. Recent years, Paul has been one of the most principled critics of the Iraq War and American foreign policy in general. But while Bush bashing is now pretty easy, Paul has distinguished himself by opposing the Iraq War on both strategic and constitutional grounds. And I'll cite one example. In October of 2002, Paul introduced legislation whereby Congress would officially declare war on Iraq, which it is their prerogative to do in the Constitution, and not simply authorize the president to do so. While another GOP candidate wants to check with his lawyers before making a military strike, Paul reminds us that we might want to perhaps check with the Constitution beforehand. Please help me welcome Representative Ron Paul.
We will make America great again.